My father spent his entire life in wood-paneled courtrooms, deciding who was valuable, who was liable, and who was ultimately expendable. In his world, power was measured in billable hours, corner offices, and the ability to silence a room with a single, sharply tailored glance. He built a dynasty on the premise that vulnerability was a character flaw and that true strength only existed in the ruthless pursuit of leverage. There is a distinct difference, however, between corporate power and survival power. It is a terrifying, shattering difference. And it is a lesson my family learned at 10,000 feet, in the back of my medevac helicopter, surrounded by the deafening roar of twin turboshaft engines and the inescapable smell of jet fuel, blood, and sheer panic. They told everyone I threw my life away. When I declined my acceptance to a top-tier law school to enlist in the United States Army, my father looked at me across a sprawling marble dining table and told me I was too fragile for the real world. He said I was running away because I lacked the psychological fortitude to compete. I was labeled the weak daughter, the invisible child, the one who couldn't handle the pressure of the family legacy, so she chose to hide in a uniform. For 10 years, I let them believe whatever narrative made them comfortable. I let them curate their perfect holiday cards while I spent my 20s in the dust, the mud, and the terrifying chaos of mass casualty triage. I learned what real fragility looked like. It isn't a lack of ambition. Fragility is a human body failing under trauma. Fragility is the look in a person's eyes when they realize their bank account cannot stop arterial bleeding. I spent a decade hardening myself into a weapon of preservation, mastering the chaotic, violent art of keeping human beings breathing when everything around them is trying to end their lives. And then came the storm. A Category 4 anomaly that tore through the coastline, shattering infrastructure and erasing the boundaries between the elite and the forgotten. It didn't care about the gated perimeter of my family's exclusive corporate retreat. It didn't care about their offshore accounts or their political connections. When the levees broke and the floodwaters rose, swallowing the ground floor of their fortified sanctuary, all their carefully accumulated leverage evaporated into the freezing, toxic surge. They were trapped on a crumbling rooftop, surrounded by a swirling black ocean that was tearing apart their reality piece by piece. They were waiting for a miracle. They were waiting for someone to prioritize their rescue, fully expecting that their status would guarantee them the first seat out of hell. What they didn't know, as they shivered in the torrential rain, looking up at the flashing strobe lights of a military aircraft cutting through the darkness, was that the person commanding that extraction was the very daughter they had erased. They were about to meet the flight medic in charge. They were about to discover that when the sky falls and the water rises, the social hierarchy they worshipped is meaningless. As my Black Hawk banked hard into the storm, the rain lashing against the plexiglass, I looked down at the tiny, desperate figures waving flashlights on the roof below. I felt the heavy, familiar weight of my helmet, the radio static buzzing in my ear. I was no longer the quiet girl sitting at the end of the dining table, absorbing their quiet disdain. I was a sovereign authority in the sky. And I was about to descend into their nightmare, entirely unrecognizable behind a dark visor and a tactical flight suit, holding the sole authority to decide exactly who was getting on my aircraft and who was staying behind in the rising dark. To understand the gravity of that night on the roof, you have to understand the architecture of the family that raised me. I grew up in a house where affection was not freely given, it was negotiated. My father ran one of the most ruthless corporate defense firms on the East Coast. He viewed every interaction as a deposition and every family dinner as an opportunity to cross-examine his children. My older brother, William, was the golden child. He was engineered in my father's exact image, sharp, transactional, entirely devoid of the messy complications of empathy. By 25, William was already a junior partner, driving a luxury sedan and speaking in the same clipped, authoritative tone our father used to dismantle witnesses. I, on the other hand, was the anomaly, the disappointment. I had the intellect, they admitted that much, but I possessed what my father clinically diagnosed as a fatal flaw. I actually cared what happened to the people at the bottom of the ladder. When I was young, they mistook my quiet observation for timidity. Because I didn't revel in the stories of bankrupting small business owners over technicalities, they concluded I lacked a spine. They built a narrative around me, brick by brick, painting me as the fragile daughter who needed to be protected from the harsh realities of the world. They didn't realize I wasn't intimidated by the world, I was repulsed by them. My father used to tell me that the world only respects two things: leverage and capital. He believed that if you didn't hold the pen that wrote the contract, you were nothing more than a casualty waiting to happen. The irony is, he was right about casualties, he just fundamentally misunderstood what a real one looked like. When I brought the Army recruiter's pamphlet into his mahogany-lined study, the silence was absolute. I was weeks away from starting at a law school I despised, perfectly positioned to become another well-dressed shark in his endless ocean. Instead, I told him I was leaving. I told him I was going to be a combat medic. He didn't yell. Yelling would have implied a loss of control. Instead, he simply adjusted his cuffs, offered a tight, patronizing smile, and said I would be back in 6 weeks. He told my mother it was a quarter-life crisis, a desperate plea for attention from a girl too weak to survive the intellectual rigors of the firm. That was the last time we spoke in person. The physical distance quickly morphed into a permanent social erasure. I became the family secret. At country club dinners and holiday galas, when people asked about me, my parents would vaguely mention I was doing some sort of government administrative work, glossing over my existence as quickly as possible. They systematically excised me from their reality because a daughter in combat boots didn't fit the pristine, high society aesthetic they spent decades cultivating. They assumed my silence was shame. They assumed I was out there failing, hiding from the brilliance of their success. They had no idea who I was becoming. While William obsessed over merger documents, I was kneeling in the dirt, learning to stop arterial bleeding. While my father complained about room temperature at luxury steakhouses, I was learning how to start an intravenous line in total darkness, in the back of a violently vibrating helicopter while someone screamed for their mother. I wasn't hiding. I was being forged in a crucible they couldn't even begin to comprehend. I was learning the exact biological cost of human fragility and discovering a reserve of psychological endurance I never knew I possessed. I earned the absolute, unspoken trust of the men and women who flew into hell beside me. I learned that true authority isn't granted by a corner office or a designer suit. It is earned through extreme competence in the face of absolute terror. And it was that exact competence that brought me back into their orbit. My National Guard unit was activated ahead of the worst storm system to hit the eastern seaboard in a century. It was a monster. A sprawling, violent hurricane that stalled over the coast, dumping historic levels of water and triggering catastrophic flooding. Bridges were washed out, cell towers collapsed. The infrastructure of modern civilization was peeled back in a matter of hours, revealing the terrifying, primitive reality beneath. My father's firm had chosen that exact weekend to host their annual executive retreat at a highly exclusive, heavily fortified resort nestled on a barrier island. It was supposed to be a weekend of golf, cigars, and strategic planning, a monument to their untouchable status, but nature does not negotiate. The storm surge obliterated the causeway, cutting them off entirely from the mainland. The lower levels of the resort flooded within minutes, trapping over 40 executives, support staff, and their families. Their private security couldn't save them. Their wealth couldn't drain the water. As the sun set and the hurricane battered the remaining structure, the only thing standing between my family and the abyss was a single-frequency radio calling out into the dark, begging for the very military they had spent a lifetime looking down upon. And I was the one listening. The radio traffic in the back of a medevac Black Hawk during a mass casualty event is a very specific type of chaos. It is a steady, relentless stream of grid coordinates, fuel calculations, and desperate voices bleeding through the static, all layered over the deafening, mechanical roar of the transmission. Flying into the teeth of a decaying hurricane requires a level of violence that is difficult to articulate to anyone who hasn't been strapped to the floor of a military aircraft. The wind shear was throwing our 14,000-pound machine around like a hollow aluminum can. The airframe shook so violently that my teeth rattled against each other, and the rain lashing against the open crew doors felt like handfuls of gravel being thrown into the cabin. But inside my helmet, beneath the dark, scratched visor and the heavy layers of Nomex and Kevlar, my breathing was completely slow, completely regulated. This is the paradox of emergency medicine in a combat or disaster environment. The more chaotic the external world becomes, the more ruthlessly quiet your internal world must be. You do not have the luxury of panic. You do not have the bandwidth for fear. You are a biological machine designed to process trauma, calculate probabilities, and execute protocols that keep oxygen flowing into failing human lungs. When the distress call came through our brigade network, identifying the exact coordinates of the barrier island and the name of the corporate retreat, my pulse did not spike. I simply looked at my crew chief across the dark, vibrating cabin, gave him a flat thumbs up, and went back to checking my trauma bags. I knew exactly who was down there. I knew the architecture of the building. I knew the arrogance of the men who had refused the mandatory evacuation orders 2 days prior, and I knew the absolute terror they must be experiencing right now. For 10 years, I had been the punchline to their private jokes. The fragile girl who couldn't handle the pressure. The disappointment who had to run away and play soldier because the boardroom was too intimidating. I had spent my entire adult life building a fortress of competence far away from their toxic judgment, and now, by some massive, inescapable twist of fate and barometric pressure, the universe was forcing our two worlds to collide at the very edge of human survival. As our pilots banked the aircraft hard to the south, fighting a massive crosswind off the Atlantic, I pushed my night vision goggles down over my eyes. The world instantly transformed into a stark, high-definition landscape of monochromatic green. What I saw below us was apocalyptic. The barrier island no longer existed as a landmass. It had been entirely swallowed by the ocean. The causeway was gone, shattered into pieces and dragged out to sea. Luxury beachfront estates were reduced to splintered lumber floating in the toxic, swirling surge. And sitting dead center in the middle of this freezing, black ocean was the resort. It looked like a tombstone jutting out of the floodwaters. The lower 3 floors were completely submerged. The auxiliary generators had clearly failed hours ago, leaving the massive structure completely dead in the water, save for the frantic, erratic sweeping of emergency flashlights on the reinforced rooftop helipad. Our pilots initiated the approach, and the mechanical screaming of the engines pitched up to a deafening whine. The downdraft from our rotors hit the standing water on the roof, whipping it into a blinding, horizontal hurricane of its own. We came down hard. The wheels slammed onto the reinforced concrete with a violence that sent a shockwave up my spine. Before the aircraft had even fully settled on its suspension, I had my restraint unclipped. The crew chief slid the cabin door fully open, and the raw, freezing violence of the storm instantly flooded the cabin. I stepped out onto the roof, the heavy tread of my boots planting firmly onto the slick concrete. The rain was blinding. The wind was howling at over 70 miles an hour, desperately trying to tear us off the edge of the building and throw us into the black water below. Through the green phosphorus glow of my night vision, I surveyed the scene. There were roughly 40 people huddled near the reinforced stairwell housing. Even through the distorted light and the driving rain, the social hierarchy was immediately, sickeningly obvious. It was the exact same hierarchy I had run away from a decade ago. In the safest, most sheltered corner of the roof, huddled tightly together in their ruined bespoke suits and high-end outerwear, were the executives, the senior partners, the golden children like my brother, William, and the patriarchs like my father. They were wet, they were terrified, and they were shivering violently, but they were fundamentally unharmed. But pushed to the outer edges of the roof, completely exposed to the wind and the freezing rain, were the people who actually bled for them, the support staff, the private catering crew. The maintenance workers who had likely been ordered into the flooded lower levels to try and salvage the servers or the backup generators before the walls gave way. This is where the real catastrophe was unfolding. In disaster medicine, we operate on a system called triage. It is cold, it is mathematical, and it is entirely devoid of sentimentality. We do not care about your bank account. We do not care about your political connections. We care about the physiological reality of your injuries. We tag you with colors: green for the walking wounded, yellow for the stable but severe, red for the immediate, life-threatening traumas that require instant intervention to prevent death, and black for the expectant, the ones who are too far gone to save with the resources we have, the ones we have to leave behind so others might live. It is the heaviest burden a human being can carry, deciding who gets the red tag and who gets the black. I moved straight past the huddled mass of executives, not even turning my head, and dropped to my knees beside a young man in a soaked catering uniform. He was pinned against a concrete barrier, his breathing rapid and shallow, his skin pale and clammy. A massive piece of debris had crushed his lower leg, and the improvised tourniquet someone had tied above the knee was failing. Arterial blood was pulsing steadily into the standing water on the roof. Without hesitating, without speaking a word, I reached into my chest rig, pulled a tactical tourniquet, threaded it high and tight around his thigh, and ratcheted the windlass down until the bleeding instantly stopped. I jammed a needle into his chest to decompress a collapsing lung, the rush of trapped air hissing softly beneath the roar of the helicopter. I was moving with a fluid, mechanical precision, completely detached from the storm, completely focused on preserving the fragile machinery of the human body in front of me. I tagged him red. He was going on my aircraft first. As I moved to the next patient, an older woman with a severe head laceration, I felt the shift in the dynamic behind me. The executives had realized the helicopter wasn't here to chauffeur them back to civilization. They realized we were prioritizing the help. The sheer indignity of it, the idea that a maid or a line cook would be evacuated before a senior partner, was tearing through their panic, replacing it with the cold, arrogant entitlement I knew so intimately. I heard the shouting before I saw them. Over the roar of the twin turboshaft engines, two figures broke away from the sheltered wall and marched directly toward the helicopter. Even walking through a hurricane, my father maintained the posture of a man walking into a courtroom to deliver a killing blow. Beside him was William, clutching a waterproof briefcase to his chest like it held the nuclear launch codes. They were completely oblivious to the trauma surrounding them. They bypassed the bleeding, they stepped over the shivering, and they walked directly up to my crew chief, a 22-year-old kid from Ohio who was currently guarding the perimeter of the aircraft. My father didn't ask for an update. He didn't ask about the status of the injured. He simply pointed at the open doors of the Black Hawk and began issuing orders. I couldn't hear the exact words over the noise of the rotors, but I didn't need to. I knew the cadence perfectly. I knew the exact physical posture of a man who believed his authority was divine right. He was trying to assert dominance over a military operation. He was trying to pull rank in a world where his rank did not exist. I watched as my crew chief held up his hand, signaling my father to stop and step back. My father's face contorted in absolute rage. He shoved his finger into the crew chief's chest, leaning in close, undoubtedly shouting his name, his net worth, his political leverage, demanding to know who was in charge of this extraction. He demanded priority. He demanded that his inner circle be loaded onto the aircraft immediately, leaving the injured staff to wait for a secondary flight that, given the weather conditions, might never come. The moral tension on that roof was suddenly thicker than the storm itself. Here was the man who had spent my entire life telling me I was weak. The man who had evaluated my worth and found it mathematically lacking. The man who had thrown me away because I possessed the exact empathy he currently viewed as an obstacle to his own survival. He was standing 10 feet away from me, demanding the power of life and death, completely unaware that the towering, armored figure kneeling in the blood and the rain, holding the absolute authority to deny him, was the very daughter he had erased. He wanted the person in charge. He was about to get her. I finished wrapping a pressure dressing around the woman's head, clipped a yellow triage tag to her collar, and slowly stood up, turning to face the man who broke my heart 10 years ago. I moved across the slick concrete, the heavy composite armor of my chest plate and the soaked fabric of my flight suit adding 50 pounds to my frame. The wind was howling at an ear-splitting pitch, whipping freezing water into every exposed crevice of my gear, but it grounded me. I didn't walk like the hesitant, quiet girl who used to tiptoe past his mahogany-lined study, terrified of making a sound. I walked with the heavy, deliberate momentum of someone who owns the ground they stand on. To him, I wasn't a human being. I was a dark, faceless obstacle wearing olive drab, dual-tube night vision goggles, and a comms headset. I was just a nameless government asset that was currently malfunctioning by not obeying his commands. As I stepped between him and my crew chief, my father didn't even pause to assess the situation. He immediately directed his wrath toward me, his voice straining until the veins in his neck bulged, desperately trying to carry his authority over the deafening mechanical scream of our twin turboshaft engines. He told me exactly who he was. He listed his title, his firm's annual revenue, and the names of the two state senators he had on speed dial, completely oblivious to the fact that the regional cell towers had been resting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean for the last 6 hours. He aggressively pointed his finger at the injured catering staff huddled by the stairwell, and then pointed back at himself and William. He began arguing with the clinical, practiced cadence of a closing argument, that their time, their intellect, and their corporate status made them mathematically more valuable to society than the people bleeding out on the concrete behind them. He actually used the term collateral damage to my face, expecting me, a soldier and a medical professional, to inherently agree with the cold logic of sacrificing the weak to preserve the strong. It was in that exact moment, watching the relentless rain plaster his silver hair to his forehead, watching his jaw clench in that familiar, terrifying way that used to send me running for the safety of my childhood bedroom, that the second emotional hit landed. But it didn't hit me with the familiar, suffocating grip of fear. It hit me with absolute, paralyzing clarity. I looked at the man who had authored every single insecurity in my life. I looked at the titan of industry, the legal savant, the unyielding patriarch who had banished me from his kingdom for being too fragile. And for the first time in my entire existence, I realized how incredibly small he actually was. He was standing in the middle of a catastrophic hurricane, surrounded by total structural failure and rising floodwaters, holding a waterproof leather briefcase, trying to litigate his way out of a natural disaster. It was utterly pathetic. The profound psychological realization washed over me, completely insulating me from the freezing rain. His entire empire, his entire concept of strength and superiority, was entirely synthetic. It only existed inside climate-controlled rooms where people were legally obligated to agree to play by his rules. He possessed absolutely no inherent biological survival value. Without his expensive suits, his sprawling desk, and the invisible social contract that allowed him to intimidate people through financial leverage, he was just a terrified aging man who was rapidly losing his core body temperature. He wasn't strong. He was just loud, and then there was William, my older brother, the golden child, the flawless prototype of the family legacy. He was standing slightly behind our father, physically cowering, his shoulders hunched aggressively against the wind. He didn't even dare to look at the bleeding people 10 feet away from him. He was completely, obsessively consumed by his own self-preservation. This was the man my father had chosen over me. A man who would gladly step over a dying woman with a crushed skull if it meant saving his own skin, and a briefcase full of wet corporate contracts. The power shift that was forming on that roof was so heavy it felt gravitational. I wasn't just standing between my family and a military helicopter. I was standing between their delusional, constructed reality and the brutal, unforgiving truth of the natural world. My father, misinterpreting my absolute, unyielding silence for submission or perhaps lower-class confusion, took a step closer. He reached into the inside pocket of his ruined suit jacket and pulled out a soaked leather money clip. He didn't care that my black visor was completely down. He didn't care that he couldn't see my eyes. He just wanted to find the price tag. He believed every single human being had a price. He leaned in, screaming over the whining turbines, telling me that there was $50,000 in a corporate trust account waiting for me and my crew if I loaded him, his son, and his 3 senior partners onto the aircraft right now. The sheer moral bankruptcy of the offer didn't shock me. It validated everything I had ever believed about them. It was the inescapable proof that I had made the correct choice 10 years ago. I didn't run away because I was weak. I ran away because I was the only one in that entire house who possessed a soul. The narrative pressure on the roof was maxing out. The storm was intensifying violently, the wind shear threatening to push our 14,000-pound aircraft right off the structural supports. My pilots were rapidly flashing the landing lights, the universal, urgent signal that our time on the roof was officially expiring. We were burning critical fuel, and my patients were rapidly deteriorating. I had 3 red tags that needed immediate surgical intervention, and I had exactly enough space in the back of my Black Hawk for them and absolutely no one else. Frustrated by my lack of a verbal response, my father tried to physically push past me. It wasn't a violent shove, but an arrogant, dismissive brush of his arm, fully expecting me to yield to his physical momentum. He expected me to step aside, just as I had always stepped aside in the grand hallways of our home whenever he walked past, but I didn't move. I didn't yield a single inch. I planted my combat boots firmly into the slick concrete, engaged my core, and let him walk directly into the solid ballistic armor plating on my chest. It was like he hit a reinforced brick wall. He stumbled backward, completely shocked by the physical resistance, losing his footing on the wet roof and nearly falling backward into the standing water. William gasped, dropping his precious briefcase onto the deck to awkwardly catch our father by the elbow. My father looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute, unadulterated outrage and sudden, unfamiliar terror. No one had ever physically stopped him before. No one had ever forcefully denied him entry. He opened his mouth to scream, to threaten, to unleash a lifetime of verbal dominance. I didn't let him speak. Slowly, deliberately, I reached up with both of my tactical gloves, gripping the heavy locking mechanisms on the sides of my flight helmet. It was time for his illusion to die. I released the locking pins on the sides of my flight helmet. The seals popped with a quiet hiss that was instantly swallowed by the howling wind and the deafening mechanical scream of the Black Hawk's turbines. With a slow, deliberate motion, I pulled the heavy Kevlar shell up and off my head, letting the freezing rain immediately plaster my hair to my face. I stared directly into my father's eyes. The physical reaction was instantaneous. The outrage and blistering indignation that had fueled him for 65 years completely vanished, replaced by a pale, hollow, uncomprehending shock. He blinked, the driving rain hitting his eyes, trying to process the absolute impossibility of the moment. The nameless, faceless military asset who had just violently rejected his authority, the flight medic who currently held his life in her hands, was the very daughter he had thrown away. Behind him, William's jaw went slack. He let out a pathetic, stuttering gasp, instinctively taking a half-step backward, retreating from my presence. For 10 years, I had played out this exact confrontation in my mind. I had imagined unloading a decade of repressed anger, demanding an apology for how they discarded me. But standing there, bathed in the flashing strobe lights of my aircraft, looking at these two terrified men, I felt absolutely no anger. I didn't need to raise my voice or prove anything. The storm and the blood on my gloves were doing all the talking. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The scale had finally balanced. My father finally managed to push a single breathless word past his lips, my name. He said it not with authority, but with a desperate, questioning fragility. I didn't smile, I didn't flinch. I just looked at him with the cold, measured detachment of a medical professional assessing a non-critical patient. I stepped closer, forcing him to look down at the bright triage tags clipped to my chest rig. I pointed a steady, gloved finger at his soaked designer suit. "Your money buys a lot of things down there, Dad," I said, my voice projecting clearly over the roar of the rotors, stripped of all emotion, carrying only the absolute weight of command. "But up here, my triage tag is the only currency that matters." I turned my back on him. It was the most powerful physical movement of my entire life. I didn't look back to see his reaction. I signaled my crew chief, pointing sharply at the injured catering staff. We moved swiftly, loading the 3 red-tagged patients into the aircraft. The young man with the crushed leg, the older woman with the head trauma, the people my father had called collateral damage. We strapped them onto the litters, treating them with the dignity and urgency they deserved. As I climbed into the cabin and pulled the heavy sliding door shut, I looked through the plexiglass window one last time. The strobe lights illuminated my father and William, standing completely alone in the freezing downpour, watching the fragile daughter they had erased ascend into the dark sky, taking their salvation with her. They were green tags. They were physically stable. They would have to wait on that flooded roof for a secondary extraction boat, shivering in the dark with the undeniable truth of their own irrelevance. As our pilots banked the aircraft north, the nose dipping as we accelerated away from the shattered island, I plugged my helmet back into the comms system. I checked the vitals on the young man beneath me, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. He was going to live. There is a quiet clarity that comes after the chaos. Sitting in the dark, vibrating belly of that aircraft, looking down at the flooded ruins of my father's empire, I realized their narrative for me was officially dead. True strength isn't debated in heavily guarded boardrooms or purchased with trust funds. True strength is proven in the darkest, most desperate moments of human survival. It is forged in the mud, the blood, and the terrifying willingness to step into the storm for someone else. They spent my entire life trying to convince me I was the weakest person in the room. It took a catastrophic hurricane for them to finally understand that I was the only one who knew how to weather the storm. Have you ever chosen a path of service that your family viewed as a failure? Tell me your story.